The aluminum skin peeled back like torn fabric, revealing the dark cavity beneath. November 1942, somewhere in the dust-choked expanse south of Tobruk, a Junkers Ju-88A-4 bomber lay crumpled against the hardpan, its twin Jumo engines cold, its crew long gone into captivity, or worse. The aircraft bore the scars of its final moments, a constellation of punctures stitched across the port wing by the 8 Browning M2 machine guns of a pursuing P-40 Warhawk. What held the attention of Captain Richard Caldwell and his Technical Air Intelligence Unit team, however, wasn't the damage. It was what the damage failed to accomplish. Caldwell crouched beside the wing, his gloved finger tracing the rim of a .50 caliber entry wound. The metal around the hole showed the expected deformation, punched inward, ragged edges, the telltale signature of a round traveling at 2,900 feet per second. He shifted his weight, following the wound through to the fuel tank liner beneath. The liner itself, a composite material that seemed to combine rubber, fabric, and something else he couldn't immediately identify, had sealed around the puncture. Not perfectly. A dark fuel stain marked where AV gas had seeped through initially, but sealed enough. Sealed well enough that the tank hadn't hemorrhaged its contents across the wing, hadn't created the fuel-air mixture that every Allied pilot counted on to send enemy bombers tumbling earthward in flames. 7 hits on this tank alone, Sergeant James Kowalski called from the opposite side of the wing. 8 if you count the one that grazed the leading edge. Most went clean through, entry and exit, but I'm not seeing catastrophic failure anywhere. Caldwell stood, brushing dust from his knees, and walked the length of the wing. Kowalski was right. Multiple penetrations, some overlapping, some isolated. The kind of fire concentration that should have turned the Ju-88 into a torch at altitude. Yet the bomber had made it far enough to attempt a forced landing, had come down intact enough that the intelligence value remained high. In the calculus of air combat, that meant something had gone wrong, or rather, something had gone very right for the Germans. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of cordite and leaking hydraulic fluid. Caldwell had examined enough wrecked aircraft to know the usual story. Fuel tanks were vulnerable points, deliberately targeted, and for good reason. Gasoline, when atomized and mixed with oxygen, delivered more explosive force than most munitions. A single tracer round kissing the vapor space above liquid fuel could produce a fireball visible for miles. That physics hadn't changed. But somehow, the Germans had found a way to mitigate it. The question was how, and more importantly, whether that how represented a fundamental gap in Allied understanding. "Pull a sample," Caldwell ordered, nodding toward the tank liner. "Full cross-section if you can manage it. I want to see what we're dealing with layer by layer, and photograph everything before you cut. I need proof that this wasn't just lucky damage placement." Kowalski retrieved his toolkit, extracting a utility knife and small saw. As he worked, Caldwell considered the broader implications. The Junkers Ju-88 had proven itself one of the Luftwaffe's most versatile platforms: bomber, night fighter, reconnaissance bird, even torpedo carrier in its naval variants. Production numbers suggested over 10,000 airframes delivered since 1939, with monthly output holding steady despite intensifying Allied bombing campaigns against German industry. If that production run incorporated fuel tank protection this effective, it represented a survivability advantage the Allies couldn't afford to ignore. The sample came free with a wet tearing sound, a rectangle roughly 8 inches by 6, still glistening with residual fuel. Caldwell accepted it, turning it over in the late afternoon light. 3 distinct layers became visible in cross-section. The outermost layer appeared to be untreated leather, approximately 2 millimeters thick, scarred now by Kowalski's saw. Beneath that, a sandwich of what looked like vulcanized rubber interspersed with fabric reinforcement. And on the interior surface, facing the fuel, a softer rubber compound that had swollen noticeably around the puncture sites. "That inner layer's doing something active," Caldwell observed. "See how it's expanded into the wound channel? Almost like it's trying to plug the hole from the inside." "Swelling response to the fuel contact," Kowalski suggested. "Same principle as a cork absorbing water, maybe?" "Maybe." Caldwell wrapped the sample in oilcloth, sealing it for transport. "But that doesn't explain the leather, or why this whole assembly appears to be working better than our own attempts at self-sealing. The last tests I saw out of Dahlgren showed our prototype liners falling apart under sustained 50 cal fire. This thing took multiple hits and kept functioning." The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Caldwell made a final circuit of the aircraft, documenting serial numbers, noting the locations of all armor plate, recording the positions of the defensive armament. Standard exploitation protocol. But his attention kept returning to those wing tanks, to the bullet holes that should have been fatal, but somehow weren't. In the emerging air war over Europe and North Africa, where bomber attrition rates were climbing toward unsustainable levels, the difference between a tank that burned and a tank that didn't could reshape the strategic balance. By the time they loaded their samples and documentation into the truck for the drive back to base, Caldwell had already begun drafting his report in his mind. A simple observation to start: enemy bomber fuel tank protection significantly exceeds current Allied capabilities. Then the harder question, the one that would require weeks or months of laboratory work and materials analysis to answer. What had the Germans figured out that US and British engineers had missed? And more urgently, how quickly could that knowledge be reverse engineered and applied to the hundreds of bombers currently flying combat missions without adequate protection? The Ju-88's shadow stretched long across the sand, a dark finger pointing east toward the next day's war. Caldwell climbed into the passenger seat, the sample package resting on his lap. Somewhere in that layered composite, in the chemistry of rubber and leather and treated fiber, lay a secret that had allowed German bomber crews to survive engagements that should have killed them. Understanding that secret had just become a matter of Allied survival. The story begins not in the desert, but in the engineering halls of Dessau, Germany, in the winter months of 1938. Ernst Zindel, chief designer at Junkers Flugzeug und Motorenwerke, faced a problem that would define the next generation of German aviation. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, had demanded a Schnellbomber, a fast bomber capable of outrunning enemy fighters through speed alone. Initial designs for what would become the Ju-88 emphasized performance above all, powerful Jumo 211 engines, dive bombing capability, a relatively light airframe. But the Spanish Civil War had delivered uncomfortable lessons. German Condor Legion pilots reported that even minor battle damage could prove catastrophic if fuel tanks were hit. Aircraft that might otherwise limp home instead became pyres at altitude, their crews lost not to structural failure, but to fire. Zindel's team studied the problem through the lens of material science and fluid dynamics. Gasoline itself was non-negotiable. The Jumo engines demanded high-octane fuel, and no substitutes existed. The vulnerability, then, lay in the tank construction and the physics of what happened when bullets met fuel-soaked metal. The solution that emerged from those engineering sessions involved compromise at every level. Adding protective layers to fuel tanks meant adding weight that directly contradicted the Schnellbomber concept. It also meant reducing internal volume, which cut into the bomber's operational range. Zindel and his engineers calculated the trade-offs with slide rules and wind tunnel data. A fuel tank liner approximately 1 centimeter thick, composed of multiple layers, could absorb bullet strikes without immediate catastrophic failure. The cost, roughly 15% reduction in fuel capacity for protected tanks, plus approximately 180 kilograms of additional weight per aircraft. The chemistry of the liner itself drew from commercial rubber manufacturing, adapted for the extreme environment of aviation. The outer layer used leather, not for its bullet-stopping capability, but for its tensile strength and resistance to petroleum degradation. Beneath the leather, Junkers engineers specified a layer of vulcanized rubber, heat-treated to create cross-linked molecular bonds that gave the material both flexibility and resilience. A middle layer of treated fabric reinforcement distributed stress. And finally, the innermost layer, untreated natural rubber that would react to fuel contact by swelling. That swelling reaction was the key mechanism. When a bullet punctured the tank, fuel immediately began leaking through the wound channel. As fuel contacted the untreated rubber, the rubber absorbed the hydrocarbons and expanded, much like a dry sponge swells when wetted. The expansion physically plugged the hole from the inside, reducing the leak to a seep. Meanwhile, the outer layers prevented the expanded rubber from simply tearing free under the aerodynamic loads and fuel pressure experienced in flight. The entire system functioned as a kind of chemical-mechanical valve, self-actuating within seconds of damage. Testing the prototype tanks involved live fire trials at the Rechlin Proving Grounds. Engineers mounted sample tanks on frames and subjected them to fire from various weapons, 7.92mm machine guns at ranges from 50 to 400 meters, analyzing penetration characteristics and seal performance. The results proved promising enough to proceed with full-scale implementation, despite the weight penalties. By the time the first operational Ju-88A1 variants entered service in September 1939, self-sealing fuel tanks were standard equipment in the wing cells. Comparison with Allied efforts at the same period reveals the scope of the German advantage. British experiments with self-sealing technology lagged behind German development by approximately 18 months. Early British attempts, tested at Portsmouth Airport by Fireproof Tanks Limited, used simpler constructions, basic rubber layers without the leather backing or the optimized layer sequence. When fitted to ferry battle light bombers and tested in combat during the Battle of France in May 1940, these early British tanks showed marginal improvement over unprotected tanks, but failed to provide reliable protection against sustained fire. American efforts evolved in parallel, but initially focused on different design philosophies. Ernst Eger at United States Rubber Company patented a self-sealing design in 1941, while James Merrill at Goodyear pursued a variant two-layer system. Both approaches incorporated rubber sealant, but the specific compounds, layer thicknesses, and backing materials differed from the German solution. Critical development work occurred at the Naval Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia, where each of the four major U.S. rubber manufacturers, Firestone, Goodrich, Goodyear, and U.S. Rubber, submitted designs for evaluation beginning in 1940. The Germans, however, had a two-year head start. By 1940, Junkers had refined its tank protection to the point where Ju-88A4 variants, the most produced model of the series, featured self-sealing in all main wing tanks, plus protective armor around crew stations. The total fuel capacity of a Ju-88A4 was approximately 1,980 liters across multiple tanks, with the protected wing cells holding the bulk of that capacity. The self-sealing system added roughly 14% to the dry weight of each protected tank assembly. For comparison, American self-sealing modifications to the B-25A bomber reduced fuel capacity from 3,450 liters to 2,627 liters, a loss of 23%. The German approach proved more efficient in preserving both capacity and function. Resource constraints shaped German implementation in ways Allied intelligence wouldn't fully appreciate until later. By 1942, Germany faced growing shortages of natural rubber as Allied naval operations interdicted supply routes. Synthetic rubber production ramped up to compensate, but synthetic compounds didn't swell as effectively in fuel contact. Junkers engineers reformulated the inner sealant layer, increasing thickness to compensate for reduced swelling capacity. The leather backing, meanwhile, came from German tanneries that could source hides domestically. Every component of the system reflected wartime economics: make it work with available materials, optimize for production simplicity, maintain effectiveness despite substitutions. This origin story of careful engineering, incremental testing, and pragmatic compromise stood in stark contrast to Allied assumptions. When U.S. intelligence officers first examined downed Ju-88s in North Africa, they anticipated finding crude heavy armor plate around fuel tanks. Instead, they discovered a sophisticated material solution that achieved protection through chemistry rather than mass. That cognitive dissonance, the gap between expectation and reality, would shape the next phase of the technical intelligence war. Understanding required not just examination, but reverse engineering at the molecular level. And time, as always in war, was the resource in shortest supply. The pattern repeated across 3 theaters and 18 months. A Ju-88 went down over Kent during the Battle of Britain, its port wing tanks punctured by hurricane gunfire, yet burning only after the aircraft impacted ground. Another fell to naval anti-aircraft fire off Crete in May 1941, its fuel system surviving multiple 40mm hits until catastrophic structural failure brought the aircraft down. A third, forced down in the western desert in June 1942, showed evidence of at least a dozen .303 caliber strikes to the starboard tanks with minimal fuel loss. Each incident generated a crashed enemy aircraft report. Each report circulated through technical intelligence channels, and each report raised the same uncomfortable question: why weren't these bombers burning in flight? The initial Allied response combined skepticism with misinterpretation. Intelligence assessments from mid-1941 suggested the Germans had simply gotten lucky with damage placement, or that Allied pilots were overestimating their hit accuracy. Some analysts proposed that the Ju-88's fuel tanks were positioned in aerodynamically favorable locations, reducing the likelihood of puncture. Others speculated about thicker tank walls or internal baffling that somehow prevented fuel ignition. What few considered was that the Germans had solved a fundamental material science problem that continued to vex Allied engineers. At Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in summer 1940, U.S. Navy engineers tested early Allied self-sealing fuel tank designs against .50 caliber fire. The results provided uncomfortable reading. Prototype tanks from British manufacturers failed to seal after 2 or 3 hits in close proximity. The rubber layers tore free under the combined stress of bullet impact and fuel pressure. Some tanks experienced zipper failures, where one hit created stress concentrations that propagated additional cracks. Test reports documented seal times, the interval between puncture and effective closure, averaging 15 to 30 seconds for successful seals, compared to German tanks which appeared to seal within 5 to 10 seconds based on combat damage analysis. The .50 caliber Browning M2 represented a particularly challenging threat. The round's kinetic energy at combat ranges exceeded that of smaller caliber weapons by a factor of 5 or more. When a .50 caliber bullet struck a fuel tank at 2,150 feet per second, it didn't simply puncture. It created a shock wave that radiated through the fuel, sometimes rupturing seams or causing adjacent areas to fail. Allied tank designs struggled to contain this secondary damage. Rubber layers thick enough to absorb the shock became so heavy that aircraft performance suffered unacceptably. Thinner layers couldn't maintain structural integrity. A specific failure mode haunted Allied designers, the exit wound. When a bullet passed completely through a tank, it created an exit hole typically 2 to 3 times larger than the entry hole due to tumbling and fragmentation. Early self-sealing designs sealed the entry point but couldn't bridge the exit crater, leaving a gaping wound that leaked fuel at catastrophic rates. Some British tests showed tanks losing 8% or 10% of their capacity within 2 minutes of through-and-through hits. By comparison, German tanks examined after recovery showed exit wounds that had partially sealed, reducing leakage to perhaps 20% capacity loss over similar timeframes. Combat reports from the Battle of Britain provided field validation of the laboratory findings. RAF pilots described pouring fire into Ju-88 formations, seeing their tracers impact enemy wings, yet failing to achieve the flash fire destruction they experienced against Heinkel He-11 and Dornier Du-17 bombers. The He-111 and Du-17, both earlier designs, initially lacked comprehensive self-sealing protection. They burned readily. The Ju-88, by contrast, absorbed punishment and maintained formation position. Damage assessment of crashed Ju-88s recovered in England showed fuel tank penetrations that should have been lethal but somehow weren't. The psychological impact on Allied aircrews proved significant. Fighter pilots who had trained to target enemy fuel tanks as primary aim points found those tactics less effective against the Ju-8. Bomber crews flying missions over Germany feared the Ju-88 in its night fighter role, not just for its radar and cannon, but for its survivability. The knowledge that wounding one wasn't enough to guarantee a kill. Morale reports noted increasing frustration with ammunition expenditure rates. Pilots estimated they needed twice as many hits on a Ju-88 to achieve mission kills compared to earlier German bomber types. Allied engineers at Wright Field in Ohio and the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough worked in parallel to close the gap. The American approach emphasized manufacturing scalability. Designs that could be mass-produced by civilian rubber companies converted to war work. Goodyear's James Merrill filed his patent for a refined 2-layer system in 1941, drawing on Dahlgren test data to optimize layer thickness in rubber compounds. His system used a layer of vulcanized rubber as the primary structural element, backed by a softer compound that swelled on fuel contact, similar in principle to the German approach but differing in specific execution and materials. The British pursued a different path, experimenting with felt backing and alternative sealant formulations. Some designs incorporated layers of felt soaked in gum rubber, theorizing that the fibrous structure would provide better stress distribution. Field trials proved disappointing. The felt absorbed fuel but didn't swell effectively, and the gum rubber degraded over time when continuously soaked in avgas. By mid-1941, British designers had largely abandoned the felt approach in favor of all-rubber constructions closer to the American model. What neither Allied program initially understood was the critical function of the German leather backing. Intelligence officers examining recovered German tanks identified the leather layer, but misinterpreted its purpose. Some reports suggested it was merely a manufacturing convenience, a base material onto which rubber could be laminated. Others theorized it provided abrasion resistance during tank installation. The actual function, containing the swollen rubber and preventing delamination under aerodynamic stress, remained opaque until detailed laboratory analysis could be performed on intact samples. That analysis required capturing a Ju-88 in sufficiently good condition that its fuel system remained essentially undamaged. The aircraft recovered in North Africa, despite its value, had sustained too much battle damage for definitive materials characterization. What the Allies needed was an intact example, ideally delivered through defection or emergency landing. The opportunity would come, but not until October 1943. Until then, Allied bombers flew with fuel tank protection that lagged German standards by an estimated 18 to 24 months of development time. The cost of that lag was measured in aircraft lost and crews killed, casualties that might have been prevented if the fuel tank secret had been unlocked sooner. The failure, ultimately, was one of imagination. Allied engineers possessed the materials science knowledge and manufacturing capability to replicate German self-sealing technology. What they lacked was the specific insight into system architecture, the way layers interacted, the optimal thickness ratios, the importance of the leather containment layer. That information couldn't be derived from distant observation or fragmentary wreckage. It required hands-on dissection of a complete operational fuel tank assembly. And until such an assembly could be obtained, Allied crews would continue flying with inferior protection, hoping that their luck would hold until engineering could catch up. October 24, 1943. The signal reached RAF headquarters in Egypt by coded radio. A German aircraft, type unknown, had landed at RAF Nicosia on Cyprus. The pilot claimed defection. Initial reports were confused. Some witnesses described the aircraft as a bomber, others as a reconnaissance variant. What mattered was the aircraft's condition, flyable, with only minor damage from a rough landing. By the time Captain Warner E. Newby of the USAAF reached Cyprus 3 days later, British intelligence officers had already completed initial interviews with the pilot, a Romanian officer named Teodoru, who had been operating under Luftwaffe command. The aircraft was a Junkers Ju-88D-1, a long-range reconnaissance variant powered by twin Jumo 211J engines. Newby, who had extensive experience with the American B-25 Mitchell bomber, recognized immediately that the Ju-88 represented an intelligence windfall. The D-1 variant differed from bomber models in carrying cameras rather than bomb racks, but the fundamental airframe, engines, and fuel system remained essentially identical. Most importantly, the aircraft had landed intact, with its fuel tanks undamaged and accessible for detailed examination. Newby's team established a secure work area at the Nicosia airfield and began systematic documentation. They photographed the aircraft from every angle, measured dimensions, recorded serial numbers from every component. The fuel system received particular attention. The Ju-88D-1 carried internal tanks in the wing roots with a combined capacity of approximately 2,400 liters, plus provisions for external drop tanks. Newby ordered careful removal of access panels covering the port wing tank, exposing the tank assembly for direct examination. What emerged over the following week of analysis fundamentally shifted Allied understanding of German fuel tank protection. The layer structure matched earlier intelligence reports: leather exterior, vulcanized rubber middle layer with fabric reinforcement, untreated rubber inner layer. But the in-situ examination revealed details that hadn't been apparent from damaged samples. The leather backing, approximately 2.5 millimeters thick at its thickest points, was stitched to the vulcanized rubber with a specific thread pattern that allowed flexure without creating leak paths. The stitching used waxed linen thread that resisted fuel degradation. The vulcanized rubber layer itself consisted of a compound that Newby's team couldn't fully characterize without laboratory equipment, but visual and tactile examination suggested a formulation optimized for elasticity and fuel resistance. Thickness varied across the tank surface, ranging from 4 to 6 millimeters, with thicker regions located at predicted bullet impact zones, primarily the lower surfaces and leading edges where combat damage analysis suggested the highest hit probabilities. This variable thickness represented design sophistication that Allied teams hadn't anticipated. The untreated rubber inner layer measured approximately 3 millimeters thick and showed a different texture than the vulcanized outer rubber, softer, more pliable, with a slight tackiness that suggested high natural rubber content. Newbie conducted a simple field test, cutting a small sample and exposing it to avgas. The rubber swelled visibly within 90 seconds, expanding to nearly double its original volume. The swelling was anisotropic, meaning it expanded more in thickness than in the lateral dimensions, exactly the behavior needed to plug a puncture hole without simply distorting away from the wound channel. But the key insight came from examining how the layers interacted under stress. Newbie's team simulated bullet impact by driving a steel punch through a removed tank section. The resulting hole showed the mechanical sequence clearly. The leather exterior resisted initial penetration, distributing some of the impact energy. Once punctured, the vulcanized rubber stretched rather than tearing, maintaining continuous coverage around the wound even as the hole gaped. The fabric reinforcement prevented the rubber from delaminating in response to shear forces, and the inner untreated rubber, now exposed to fuel, began swelling immediately, pressing outward against the vulcanized layer which contained and shaped the swelling into an effective plug. The leather's true function became clear. It acted as a containment membrane that prevented the swollen inner rubber from simply bulging outward under fuel pressure and aerodynamic loads. Without the leather, the sealing rubber would deform into a bubble, eventually rupturing from fatigue or catching airflow that would tear it free. With the leather providing tensile backup, the seal remained stable even under combat flight conditions. This insight, that the leather wasn't merely backing but an integral part of the sealing mechanism, represented the breakthrough Allied engineers had been seeking since 1940. Newby transmitted his initial findings to Wright Field via encrypted cable on November 2, 1943. The message emphasized the multi-layer architecture and specifically called out the leather containment layer as a critical feature missing from current Allied designs. He recommended immediate testing of leather-backed configurations and urged coordination with Goodyear and Firestone, the primary U.S. manufacturers of self-sealing fuel cells, to incorporate the findings into production specifications. The Ju-88D-1 itself, christened Bakshish by its American caretakers, underwent extensive modification for the flight to the United States. Newby's team removed the defensive armament and cameras, fitted external fuel tanks salvaged from crashed P-38 Lightnings, and jury-rigged fuel pumps from a B-24 to manage the complex fuel system during the multi-leg transit. The aircraft departed Cyprus on October 14th, flying via Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Ascension Island, Brazil, and finally to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. The journey covered over 10,000 miles and required 19 days, but delivered an intact German bomber to U.S. test facilities where comprehensive evaluation could proceed. At Wright Field, engineers disassembled the fuel tanks completely, subjecting each component to chemical analysis, tensile testing, and live fire qualification. They confirmed Newby's field observations about the layer structure and mechanical interactions. Additional testing revealed that the German sealant rubber formulation contained approximately 85% natural rubber with carbon black filler and small amounts of sulfur for vulcanization control. The leather was tanned cattle hide, vegetable tanned rather than chrome tanned, which provided better fuel resistance. The vulcanized rubber middle layer used a harder compound, approximately Shore A70 durometer, that maintained elasticity down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, critical for high-altitude operations. Armed with this detailed characterization, U.S. manufacturers accelerated refinement of self-sealing fuel cells. Goodyear's production tanks, which had entered service in 1942 on aircraft like the F-4U Corsair, received specification updates in early 1944, incorporating leather or synthetic leather backing layers. Firestone pursued a parallel effort using laminated fabric as a leather substitute, aiming for weight reduction. By mid-1944, American bombers rolling off assembly lines at Willow Run and other facilities incorporated self-sealing systems that approached German performance standards, albeit through slightly different material combinations adapted to U.S. manufacturing capabilities and supply chains. The Ju-88D-1's journey from defection to dissection to design improvement represented technical intelligence at its most effective. A single aircraft, delivered intact by circumstance and the defector's skill, provided insights that crash site recovery and combat assessment couldn't achieve. The knowledge gained didn't just improve one aircraft type. It influenced fuel tank protection standards across the entire U.S. bomber and fighter fleet. The cost in crew lives and lost aircraft before that knowledge became available remained incalculable, but at least the gap had finally closed. The fuel tank secret was secret no more. The fuel tank breakthrough influenced doctrine in ways that reverberated through every level of air combat operations. By late 1943, Allied tactical intelligence had codified the lesson. Hitting a Ju-88's wings no longer guaranteed a kill. Fighter pilot training evolved accordingly. Gunnery instructors at bases across Britain and North Africa emphasized new aim points: engines, cockpit, control surfaces. The wings, formerly prime targets, became secondary objectives unless the fighter had ammunition to spare for sustained fire. This doctrinal shift reflected deeper strategic realities about the German bomber force. The Ju-88 hadn't just survived in service, it had proliferated. Production numbers told the story clearly. By end of 1943, German factories had delivered approximately 12,000 Ju-88s across all variants. Monthly output peaked at around 370 units in late 1943. The bomber served in every theater where the Luftwaffe operated: Western Europe, the Eastern Front, North Africa, the Mediterranean, even anti-shipping operations over the Arctic. Its versatility, quick change capability from bomber to night fighter to reconnaissance platform, made it force multiplier that kept appearing in mission briefings when Allied planners hoped German bomber strength was waning. The fuel tank protection contributed directly to operational availability. Aircraft that might have been lost to fuel system fires instead returned to base damaged but repairable. German maintenance crews could patch bullet holes, replace leaking tank sections, and return the bomber to service within days rather than writing off the entire airframe. This reduced the replacement rate, stretching German production capacity. An internal Luftwaffe study from mid-1943 estimated that self-sealing tanks had improved Ju-88 combat survivability by approximately 23% compared to unprotected configurations. That percentage translated to hundreds of aircraft and thousands of trained crew members who survived engagements that would otherwise have been fatal. The ripple effects touched Allied strategic planning. USAAF target selection for daylight precision bombing missions over Germany initially prioritized aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and synthetic fuel production facilities. The objective was attrition: destroy German manufacturing capability, reduce the number of operational aircraft available for defense. But as Allied intelligence recognized the Ju-88's high survivability, target priorities shifted to include rubber manufacturing plants and chemical factories that supplied tank sealant materials. Disrupting the supply chain for self-sealing components became a strategic objective alongside disrupting airframe production itself. German fuel tank doctrine extended beyond mere protection. The Ju-88's fuel system incorporated redundancy and compartmentalization that compounded the benefit of self-sealing. Multiple tanks distributed throughout the wings and fuselage center section meant that damage to one tank didn't cripple the aircraft. Automatic fuel management systems, cross-feed valves, and balance controls allowed pilots to isolate damaged tanks and continue operations on remaining capacity. Combined with self-sealing, this architecture created a bomber that could absorb significant battle damage and still complete its mission profile. Survivability metrics showed the doctrine working as intended. RAF Fighter Command records from the Battle of Britain indicated an average of 17.3 caliber hits required to down a Ju-88, compared to 11.8 hits for a Heinkel He 111. The difference reflected the Ju-88's structural ruggedness and fuel tank protection. By late war, when .50 caliber weapons became standard on Allied fighters, the average rose to 22.1 hits per Ju-88 kill. Pilots reported frustration with ammunition expenditure, emptying half their gun belts into a single bomber and watching it disappear into cloud cover, trailing smoke but still flying. The German advantage in fuel tank technology shaped another doctrinal element: bomber employment in high-threat environments. Luftwaffe operational planning accepted higher risk for Ju-88 units because the aircraft's survivability reduced losses to tolerable levels. Missions that would be considered suicidal for less protected bombers became acceptable for Ju-88 formations. Low-altitude anti-shipping strikes, night intruder operations over Britain, daylight reconnaissance over heavily defended targets, all leveraged the Ju-88's ability to take hits and keep flying. For the Allies, countering this capability required reassessing their own fuel tank protection programs. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator heavy bombers both incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks by 1942, but early implementations suffered from the same limitations that plagued fighter aircraft: inadequate seal performance against a 50 caliber and 20 mm cannon fire. Combat loss rates over Germany in 1943 reached 5–8% per mission, with fuel tank fires contributing to approximately 35% of aircraft losses. The realization that German bombers enjoyed superior protection accelerated U.S. tank development efforts, but the lag time between improved designs and fleet-wide implementation measured in months. Strategic bombing doctrine itself bore marks of the fuel tank equation. Allied planners understood that attacking defended targets in daylight without fighter escort meant accepting catastrophic losses. The famous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids of August 1943 demonstrated the calculus brutally. 60 B-17s lost from a force of 376, a 16% loss rate. Fuel tank fires accounted for a significant portion of those losses. The raid underscored that strategic bombing couldn't achieve objectives if bombers couldn't survive to reach targets. The temporary suspension of deep penetration raids until long-range escort fighters became available reflected implicit acknowledgement that protection technology, fuel tanks, armor, defensive armament mattered as much as bomb capacity. Night operations presented different challenges where fuel tank protection intersected with detection risk. British RAF Bomber Command, conducting night area bombing, relied on darkness and electronic countermeasures for survivability. But Luftwaffe night fighters, many of them Ju-88 variants equipped with radar, proved devastatingly effective. The irony wasn't lost on Allied aircrew. They flew missions against targets that included Ju-88 assembly plants, while Ju-88 night fighters hunted them using the same self-sealing technology that made those bombers hard to kill in daylight. The doctrinal lesson solidified into training manuals and tactical bulletins by mid-1944. Survivability technology mattered. It wasn't enough to build fast aircraft or heavily armed aircraft. They had to be protected aircraft, capable of absorbing damage and returning crews safely. The fuel tank's secret, that seemingly prosaic detail of rubber and leather layering, had demonstrated strategic significance. Future aircraft design would have to incorporate protection from the earliest conceptual stages, not as afterthought, but as fundamental requirement. That lesson, learned at high cost, would shape aviation engineering long after the war ended. July 10, 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, entered its second day. Above the invasion beaches at Gela, a mixed formation of 12 Ju-88 AMA-4 bombers approached at 11,500 feet, threading through broken clouds toward the concentrations of Allied shipping below. They had launched from Grottaglie airfield on the Italian mainland an hour earlier, each bomber carrying a mixed load of 250 kgs and 50 kgs bombs intended for the transport vessels clustered offshore. The formation maintained tight cohesion, defensive guns manned, aware that Allied fighter sweeps controlled the sky, but unable to abort a mission critical to German defensive efforts. Lieutenant James Ferguson, flying a P-38J Lightning with the 1st Fighter Group, spotted the formation from 15,000 feet. His flight of 4 had been running combat air patrol over the invasion fleet for the past 90 minutes, monotonous work until the junkers appeared like a gift. Ferguson called the contact, established clear radio discipline with his wingmen, and initiated an overhead approach designed to minimize the bomber's defensive fire window. The geometry was textbook: dive from the sun, close to 400 yards, open fire, break away before defensive guns could track effectively. Ferguson centered his first target, a Ju-88 in the formation's lower left position, and pressed the trigger. The P-38's nose battery of 120 mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns lit up, sending a stream of rounds downrange at a combined rate of 20,300 rounds per minute. Ferguson held the trigger for a 3-second burst, walked his tracers across the bomber's fuselage and into the port wing. He saw hits spark along the wing surface, saw pieces of aluminum skin fleck away, and then broke hard right as return fire from the Ju-88's dorsal gunner stitched past his canopy. The bomber remained in formation. No smoke, no fire, no observable decrease in airspeed or altitude. Ferguson swore, banked left to set up another pass, and keyed his radio. "One more time, same target, follow me in." The second pass came from a beam, slightly above, with Ferguson accepting higher risk from defensive fire to maximize hit probability. He opened fire at 500 yards and held through to 300, closer than doctrine recommended but necessary to ensure solid hits. The bomber's port wing became a constellation of impacts, at least a dozen rounds striking within a 3-foot circle around the outboard fuel tank. Ferguson broke away, his lightning rolling inverted to dive out of the engagement envelope, and looked back in time to see fuel streaming from the bomber's wing. A dark vapor trail extended behind the aircraft, the mist catching sunlight like suspended diamonds. But still, no fire. The fuel atomized, created exactly the vapor-air mixture that should ignite from any spark, tracer, or hot surface. The bomber continued flying, maintained position in formation, showed no sign of immediate catastrophic failure. Ferguson's wingman hammered the same target on the next pass, adding another 15 to 20 strikes to the wing. More fuel spray, more vapor trail, but the Ju-88 pressed on toward its release point. The engagement lasted 7 minutes and consumed roughly 65% of Ferguson's ammunition. The targeted Ju-88 eventually broke formation, not from fire or structural failure, but from progressive fuel loss reducing engine performance. Ferguson and his flight watched the bomber descend toward the Mediterranean, trailing its vapor plume until it disappeared at low altitude heading northeast. Whether it made landfall or ditched at sea remained unknown. What was known, documented in Ferguson's mission report filed that evening, was that the bomber had absorbed an estimated 35 to 40 hits from mixed 150 caliber and 20 mm fire, sustained obvious fuel tank damage, and refused to burn. The bomber's wreckage, recovered 2 weeks later by Allied forces advancing through southern Sicily, told the rest of the story. Technical intelligence officers identified it as WNFR 144023, a Ju-88A4 from 2 KG-54, based on painted markings and serial number plates. The port wing showed 18 separate impact points, 14 of which had penetrated the fuel tank. The self-sealing liner had functioned as designed, swelling to plug most holes, but the cumulative damage and fuel loss had forced the crew to ditch short of their base. The crew survived, captured by U.S. Army units near Licata, and provided confirmation during interrogation that the aircraft had remained flyable until fuel exhaustion forced the landing. Ferguson's experience wasn't unique. Combat reports from Sicily and the subsequent Italian campaign repeatedly described Ju-88s absorbing fire that should have been lethal. A P-47 pilot from the 325th Fighter Group reported expending over 450 caliber rounds at a single Ju-88, achieving what he estimated as 50-60 hits before the bomber escaped into cloud cover. Another engagement near Naples in September 1943 involved 6 Spitfires from RAF 111 Squadron engaging 3 Ju-88s. The Spitfires claimed 1 bomber destroyed and 1 damaged, but the damaged aircraft made it back to its base at Foggia despite having 4 fuel tanks punctured. Ground crews photographed the damage. The images circulated through intelligence channels showing self-sealing liners that had held together despite massive trauma. The pattern revealed operational realities about air combat mathematics. Kill probability wasn't a simple function of hits scored. It depended on where those hits landed and what happened afterward. Hitting a Ju-88's wing might punch 20 holes in its skin, but if the fuel tank sealed and the aircraft could maintain flight, the hit count became irrelevant. Fighter pilots adapted their tactics, focusing fire on vulnerable points, engines, cockpits, control runs. But those targets were smaller, harder to hit, and often protected by armor plate. The fuel tanks offered larger target areas, but proved frustratingly resilient. Ground attack missions told similar stories. P-47 Thunderbolts strafing German airfields in Italy reported parked Ju-88s that survived multiple strafing passes. The 50 caliber API, armor-piercing incendiary, rounds designed specifically to ignite fuel should have turned parked bombers into scrap metal. Instead, damage assessment photographs showed Ju-88s with perforated wings still structurally intact, still potentially repairable. German recovery crews could tow these aircraft to maintenance facilities, replace the damaged tank sections, and return them to service. The fuel tank protection extended survivability beyond combat into the recovery and repair cycle. At the strategic level, these individual engagement stories aggregated into concerning statistics for Allied planners. Expected loss rates for Ju-88 units operating over Sicily ran approximately 3 to 4% per mission, lower than losses experienced by other Axis bomber types and substantially lower than losses the Luftwaffe had suffered during the Battle of Britain when German bombers lacked adequate fighter escort. The Ju-88's fuel tank protection contributed directly to this survivability advantage, allowing the Luftwaffe to sustain operations with smaller replacement aircraft flow from factories. For an air force already stretched thin across multiple fronts, that efficiency multiplier mattered strategically. Ferguson himself flew 67 combat missions before rotating back to the United States in March 1944. He estimated that roughly 40% of his confirmed kills were Ju-88s or Ju-88 family variants. In his after-action reports and debriefings, he consistently noted the bomber's toughness, particularly its resistance to wing hits. His recommendations influenced training curriculum at stateside fighter gunnery schools. By mid-1944, instructors were teaching specific aim point doctrine for engaging protected bombers. Target the engines first, the cockpit second, and only expend ammunition on wing shots if no better options existed. The fuel tank secret had forced adaptation at the tactical level, one engagement and one frustrated pilot at a time. The strategic calculus of bomber production defied simple analysis, but certain numbers told their own story. Between 1939 and 1945, German factories delivered approximately 15,000 Ju-88s across all variants, making it the most produced German multi-engine combat aircraft and the second most produced German aircraft overall after the Bf-109 fighter. That production run required approximately 240,000 tons of aluminum, 18,000 tons of rubber, 45,000 aircraft engines, and employed a workforce that peaked at over 35,000 workers distributed across plants in Dessau, Bernburg, Braunschweig, and occupied territories. The self-sealing fuel tank system added measurable cost to each airframe. Rubber consumption per aircraft increased by an estimated 185 kilograms compared to unprotected tanks. That rubber came from two sources: natural rubber imported from Asia until 1942, and synthetic rubber produced domestically from coal-based chemical processes thereafter. By 1943, Germany's synthetic rubber production reached approximately 120,000 tons annually, with roughly 15% allocated to aviation uses including fuel tank liners, tire manufacturing, and hydraulic seals. The fuel tank share of that allocation represented a strategic commitment, diverting rubber from other military uses to preserve bomber survivability. The leather component of the tank liner created different supply chain pressures. Each Ju-88 required approximately 22 square meters of vegetable-tanned cattle hide for complete fuel tank protection. German tanneries produced roughly 40 million square meters of leather annually during the war, with military contracts absorbing 60% of output. Aviation fuel tanks competed with boot manufacturing, equipment straps, and other military leather goods for limited capacity. The competition intensified as the war progressed and cattle herds decreased due to food shortages. By 1944, German engineers experimented with synthetic leather substitutes and rubberized fabric alternatives to reduce dependency on natural hide, achieving mixed results. The production economics revealed interesting trade-offs. Self-sealing tanks added approximately 220 Reichsmarks to the per-aircraft cost, roughly 3% of a Ju-88's total price of 7,300 RM for a basic A4 variant. But the survivability benefit reduced aircraft replacement needs. German maintenance records suggested that Ju-88s with self-sealing tanks achieved an average of 67 combat missions before being lost or damaged beyond repair, compared to 52 missions for earlier unprotected variants. That 29% improvement in operational lifespan meant that protecting 100 aircraft delivered the equivalent combat output of 129 unprotected aircraft. The math favored investment in protection. Allied intelligence, tracking German production through reconnaissance photographs, prisoner interrogation, and captured documents, noted the sustained Ju-88 output with concern. The expectation had been that strategic bombing would degrade German aircraft production significantly by mid-1943. Instead, Ju-88 monthly output remained relatively stable at 300,370 units through 1943, only declining sharply in 1944 when Allied air attacks on German industry intensified. The bomber's modularity, the ability to convert airframes between bomber, night fighter, and reconnaissance configurations, allowed German planners to respond to changing tactical requirements without redesigning production tooling. The night fighter variants, designated Ju-88G and Ju-88R, incorporated the same basic fuel tank protection as bomber models. This became strategically significant as the Ju-88 night fighter proved devastatingly effective against RAF Bomber Command. Between August 1943 and March 1944, Ju-88 night fighters claimed over 1,200 RAF heavy bombers shot down, accounting for roughly 45% of total RAF bomber losses in that period. The irony circulated through Allied air staff discussions. German bombers, protected by technology Allied bombers lacked, had become the primary killers of Allied bombers over Germany. The economic analysis extended to Allied countermeasures. U.S. and British production of self-sealing fuel cells ramped up dramatically in 1943, as manufacturers applied lessons from German technology. Goodyear alone produced over 800,000 self-sealing fuel cell assemblies in 1943, with roughly 35% going to bomber aircraft and the remainder to fighters. The rubber consumption for this effort diverted approximately 12,000 tons of synthetic rubber from tire manufacturing, requiring careful balancing of military priorities. Natural rubber remained in critically short supply throughout the war due to Japanese occupation of Southeast Asian sources. The U.S. synthetic rubber program, initiated in 1942, eventually achieved production levels sufficient to meet military needs, but the 1943 early 1944 period required strict rationing. Manufacturing complexity created bottlenecks on both sides. Self-sealing fuel tanks couldn't be mass-produced with the same efficiency as simple metal tanks. Each tank required hand layup of rubber sheets, careful alignment of reinforcement fabric, precision cutting to match airframe contours, and quality control testing to ensure seal integrity. U.S. manufacturers addressed scaling challenges by developing semi-automated processes, preformed rubber sheets, standardized tank shapes, assembly line installation procedures. German manufacturers, facing different resource constraints, emphasized repair and reconditioning, recovering damaged tanks from crashed aircraft, cutting out the damaged sections, splicing in new material, and returning the tanks to service. The attrition math favored protection in ways that shaped production strategy. Consider a simplified model. A force of 1,000 bombers, with each aircraft suffering an average of 8% combat losses per month and achieving an average of 1.5 missions per month. Without fuel tank protection, fuel-related fires account for 35% of losses, yielding monthly attrition of 42 aircraft. With effective protection reducing fuel-related losses by 70%, monthly attrition drops to 32 aircraft. Over a year, the difference accumulates to 120 aircraft, roughly equivalent to 1 month's production from 2 large factories. The saved production capacity could be redirected to other aircraft types or allowed for stockpiling reserves. German strategic planners understood these dynamics. Documents captured after the war, including meeting notes from Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's conferences with aircraft manufacturers, show repeated emphasis on survivability features. The goal wasn't just producing aircraft, it was producing aircraft that would return from missions. Fuel tank protection received priority even as other areas faced cutbacks. When rubber shortages in 1944 forced compromises, German engineers reduced rubber content in non-critical components like engine mounts and cabin seals rather than degrading fuel tank liners. The strategic impact rippled through every level of air war economics. It influenced factory targeting priorities, materials allocation, pilot training focus, and even diplomat efforts to secure resource supplies. A fuel tank, that prosaic container that simply held gasoline, became a nexus of strategic significance precisely because its failure meant the entire aircraft and crew were lost. Protecting it meant preserving combat power, maintaining operational tempo, and extracting maximum value from limited industrial capacity. The Germans had recognized this earlier than the Allies, implemented solutions more comprehensively, and reaped strategic benefits that extended far beyond the technical specifications of rubber and leather layers. The fuel tank secret was, ultimately, a secret about resource allocation and strategic priorities as much as material science. By December 1943, Allied air forces had accumulated sufficient hard data on German fuel tank protection to begin systematic countermeasure development. The efforts proceeded along three parallel tracks: weapons technology, tactical employment, and defensive protection improvements for Allied aircraft. Each track reflected different approaches to solving the same problem: how to defeat an enemy bomber that refused to burn. The weapons technology approach focused on ammunition optimization. Standard .50 caliber ball ammunition, solid lead core with copper jacket, punched clean holes in fuel tanks but created minimal secondary damage. The self-sealing mechanism could handle these punctures easily. Allied armament engineers experimented with alternative loadouts designed to defeat sealing. The first iteration combined armor-piercing incendiary rounds, which had phosphorus or magnesium tips, with standard ball ammunition. The API rounds ignited upon impact, theoretically providing ignition sources for leaking fuel. Field tests showed modest improvement. API heavy belt configurations increased post-hit fire probability from approximately 12 to 19 for protected tanks. More promising results came from alternating API with HEI, high explosive incendiary, rounds. The HEI projectiles detonated on impact, creating larger wound channels and dispersing incendiary material over wider areas. Laboratory testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland demonstrated that HEI rounds penetrating self-sealing tanks created exit wounds 40% larger than standard ball ammunition, overwhelming the sealing capacity in many cases. Recommended belt configurations evolved to 1:1:1 ratios of ball, API, HEI, providing a mix of penetration, ignition, and explosive effects. But ammunition alone couldn't overcome determined engineering. The real breakthrough came from tactical doctrine changes emphasizing shot placement over volume of fire. Fighter Command developed new gunnery doctrine that de-emphasized wing targets entirely when engaging protected bombers. The revised attack profile called for initial passes targeting engines, specifically the nacelles where fuel lines and oil lines concentrated in vulnerable clusters. Engine fires proved more reliable kill mechanisms than fuel tank fires. A single 20mm cannon hit to an engine nacelle could sever fuel feeds, rupture oil reservoirs, and compromise cooling systems simultaneously. The cockpit became the secondary aim point. Pilot incapacitation offered a different path to mission kill than structural destruction. Even bombers with intact fuel tanks couldn't complete missions if their pilots were dead or wounded. This calculus drove adoption of specialized bomber-destroyer fighter configurations mounting heavier forward armament. The P-47 received experimental 37mm cannon installations. The P-38 could be configured with a 20mm cannon plus 4 50 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose, offering devastating 1-second burst mass. British Beaufighters and Mosquitoes, operating as night fighters, mounted quad 20mm cannon batteries, specifically for engaging bombers. Training evolved to match the new doctrine. Gunnery schools at bases across the United States and Britain incorporated deflection shooting drills emphasizing small, hard targets rather than center mass fuselage hits. Gun camera footage from successful engagements became training material, showing students exactly where effective hits landed. The training emphasized patience, making multiple passes if necessary to achieve engine or cockpit hits rather than expending ammunition on low-probability wing shots. The tactical employment track focused on engagement geometry. Frontal attacks approaching head-on to the bomber offered brief windows where defensive fire was minimal and the fighter's closure rate minimized exposure time. The downside was extremely difficult deflection shooting at combined closing speeds exceeding 500 km/h. Few pilots possessed the skill to achieve consistent hits in frontal passes. The doctrine nevertheless encouraged frontal attacks as opening moves, accepting low hit probability in exchange for disrupting bomber formations and forcing defensive maneuvering. Coordinated attacks by multiple fighters showed better results. 2-ship or 4-ship elements could engage a single bomber from different angles simultaneously, overwhelming defensive gunners and increasing probability that at least one fighter would achieve effective hits. The tactics required disciplined radio communication and good situational awareness to avoid fratricide, Allied fighters accidentally shooting each other while focused on the bomber target. Training and practice improved coordination, with veteran units achieving impressive teamwork by mid-1944. The third track, improving Allied bomber protection, drew directly from German technology analysis. The intact Ju-88 delivered to Wright Field in late 1943 provided the template. U.S. manufacturers, led by Goodyear and Firestone, refined their self-sealing designs to incorporate leather backing or synthetic equivalents. Production tanks rolling off assembly lines in early 1944 featured 3-layer constructions closely mimicking German architecture. Outer containment layer, middle elastic layer, inner swelling sealant layer. The materials differed, U.S. synthetic rubber formulations, American tanning processes, but the functional principles remained the same. Retrofitting existing bomber fleets proved logistically challenging. The B-17 and B-24 both carried multiple fuel tanks distributed throughout wings and fuselage. Removing old tanks, installing upgraded tanks with improved sealing, and validating the modifications required taking aircraft offline for depot-level maintenance. The 8th Air Force, operating from Britain, staged a rolling retrofit program through winter 1943 to 1944. Pulling bomber groups offline for 2-week maintenance cycles. By April 1944, roughly 75% of the 8th Air Force heavy bomber fleet had received improved fuel tank protection. The remaining 25% received upgrades as they cycled through scheduled maintenance. The tactical impact of improved protection showed up in loss statistics. 8th Air Force bomber loss rates over Germany, which had peaked at 5 to 8% per mission in late 1943, declined to 3–5% per mission by mid-1944. Multiple factors contributed to the decline: better fighter escort, declining Luftwaffe strength, improved tactics, but post-mission damage assessment indicated that fuel tank fire casualties specifically had decreased by approximately 40%. More bombers were making it home with fuel tank damage that would previously have been catastrophic. The German secret, once revealed and replicated, was saving Allied lives. Fighter aircraft received similar attention. The P-51 Mustang, entering service in large numbers in 1944, incorporated advanced, self-sealing tanks from initial production. The P-51's vulnerable point was its internal fuselage tank located behind the pilot, which lacked adequate protection in early models and proved susceptible to fire. Retrofit programs added self-sealing and armor plate around this tank, reducing fire risk substantially. The P-47 Thunderbolt, already relatively well protected, received incremental improvements in tank quality and seal reliability. Naval aviation pursued parallel improvements for carrier-based aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair both featured self-sealing tanks, but combat experience in the Pacific highlighted gaps in protection coverage. Japanese 20mm cannon fire proved more damaging than the .303 caliber and 7.7mm rounds for which most tanks were designed. Upgraded tank specifications emphasized resistance to larger caliber hits, accepting weight penalties to achieve protection. By 1945, U.S. naval aircraft featured fuel tank protection meeting, or exceeding German standards, closing the capability gap that had existed early in the war. The countermeasures, taken together, represented a comprehensive response to the fuel tank challenge. No single approach sufficed. Ammunition improvements alone couldn't overcome good tank design, tactical changes alone couldn't guarantee kills, and Allied tank upgrades couldn't eliminate vulnerability entirely. But the combination created a new equilibrium. German bombers remained tough targets, but not invincible ones. Allied bombers became harder to kill, reducing loss rates to sustainable levels. The air war continued, but with different mathematics governing survival and attrition. The secret was countered, not through a single breakthrough, but through patient, systematic improvement across multiple dimensions of the problem. The war ended in May 1945, but the fuel tank story continued into peacetime with unexpected consequences. Military aviation had learned an expensive lesson about survivability, one measured in thousands of crew lives and hundreds of burned aircraft. The question became whether civilian aviation would benefit from that knowledge or whether the lessons would remain siloed within military organizations. Initially, compartmentalization prevailed. Self-sealing fuel tank technology remained classified through 1946, considered militarily sensitive, even as surplus military aircraft flooded the civilian market. Early attempts to declassify faced resistance from Navy and Air Force officials, who argued that fuel tank protection details could benefit potential adversaries. The argument proved weak. The technology had been independently developed by multiple nations, captured examples existed in museums, and the basic principles appeared in open literature. Declassification proceeded gradually through 1947 and 1948. Commercial aviation interest emerged slowly. Civilian aircraft operated in fundamentally different environments than combat aircraft. The threat wasn't enemy gunfire, but mechanical failure, fuel line ruptures, crash impacts. Early airline operators focused on reliability and cost control rather than battle damage protection. The prevailing attitude held that civilian fuel tanks didn't need self-sealing because they wouldn't be shot at. This reasoning would prove tragically short-sighted. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided fresh validation for self-sealing technology. UN forces, primarily American, operated aircraft with improved fuel tank protection developed during and after World War II. Chinese and North Korean aircraft, mostly Soviet-supplied types, featured varying levels of protection depending on model and production year. Combat attrition data showed familiar patterns. Protected aircraft survived damage at higher rates, reducing replacement needs. The U.S. Air Force lost approximately 100 aircraft over 3 years of combat, with fuel system fires contributing to roughly 20% of losses, a figure that would have been significantly higher without self-sealing technology. Military specifications evolved in parallel with operational experience. The U.S. military formalized fuel tank protection requirements through military specifications, eventually standardized as MIL DTL 27422 for crashworthy tanks, and MIL DTL 5578 for non-crashworthy applications. These specifications defined performance criteria: seal time after puncture, leak rate limitations, resistance to specific projectile types, durability under thermal cycling and aging. Manufacturers bidding on military contracts had to demonstrate compliance through laboratory testing and qualification programs. The specifications drove continuous improvement in materials and design. Modern military fuel tanks evolved beyond simple self-sealing to incorporate multiple protective features. Inert gas generation systems flooded tank vapor spaces with nitrogen, eliminating the oxygen required for combustion. Foam baffles divided tank interiors into thousands of small cells, preventing flame propagation even if ignition occurred. Crash-resistant materials and mounting systems protected tanks during hard landings or accidents. The technology that began with rubber and leather in 1940 had grown into sophisticated systems engineering by the 1970s. Civilian aviation's relationship with fuel tank safety followed a darker path, marked by disasters that might have been prevented. The most consequential was TWA Flight 800, a Boeing 747 that exploded over the Atlantic Ocean near Long Island on July 17, 1996, killing all 230 people aboard. The investigation, conducted by the NTSB, ultimately attributed the disaster to ignition of fuel vapors in the center wing tank. The exact ignition source remained uncertain, but the catastrophic result demonstrated that civilian airliners remained vulnerable to fuel tank fires from electrical faults, sparks, or overheating. The TWA 800 disaster catalyzed regulatory change. The FAA initiated a comprehensive review of fuel tank safety, examining design practices, maintenance procedures, and operational limitations that had developed over decades of commercial aviation. The review revealed uncomfortable truths. Commercial aircraft fuel tanks lacked the protection features considered standard in military aviation: no inert gas systems, no foam suppression, minimal attention to vapor space flammability. The FAA's response, finalized in 2008, mandated fuel tank inerting systems for newly manufactured aircraft and retrofit programs for existing fleets. The regulation required that fuel tanks be designed to minimize flammability, either through inerting or through design features that prevented ignition source creation. Implementation timelines extended through 2014 for new production and 2017 for in-service aircraft, reflecting the complexity and cost of retrofit programs. The inerting systems adopted by commercial aviation drew directly from military technology. Onboard inert gas generation systems, typically using bleed air from engines passed through nitrogen-enriching membranes, flooded fuel tanks with nitrogen-enriched air that displaced oxygen. With oxygen concentration reduced to below 12, the fuel vapors couldn't sustain combustion regardless of ignition source presence. The systems added weight and complexity, but the safety benefit justified the cost in post-TWA 800 regulatory environment. Modern commercial aircraft entering service in the 2010s and beyond incorporate fuel tank safety as baseline design requirements. The Boeing 787 and Airbus A350 both feature comprehensive inerting systems, crash-resistant tank designs, and redundant safety features. The technology evolution from World War II-era self-sealing tanks to modern inert gas systems represents 75 years of continuous improvement, driven initially by military combat requirements and later by civilian accident investigation findings. Military aviation continues advancing protective technology. Current generation fighters like the F-35 incorporate fuel tanks that combine crashworthiness, inerting, self-sealing, and fire suppression into integrated systems. The tanks can survive multiple hits from 23mm cannon fire, prevent ignition through inerting, seal small punctures automatically, and deploy fire suppressant foam if flames do occur. The multi-layered protection reflects lessons learned over decades of combat and testing. The commercial manufacturers of military fuel tanks, companies like Meggitt, formerly Goodyear, Amfuel, formerly Firestone Zodiac, and GKN, trace their lineages directly to the World War II-era manufacturers who developed self-sealing technology under wartime pressure. The institutional knowledge accumulated over 80-plus years of fuel tank design remains concentrated in these specialized firms, creating barriers to entry for potential competitors. Military procurement relies on this established expertise, accepting limited competition in exchange for proven reliability. The legacy extends beyond hardware to safety culture. Aviation's emphasis on crashworthiness, redundancy, and fault tolerance reflects lessons absorbed at organizational levels. The understanding that fuel tanks represent critical vulnerability points, that protection requires multi-layered approaches, and that safety investments reduce long-term costs, these principles permeate modern aerospace engineering. They originated in the crucible of World War II air combat, were validated through subsequent conflicts, and eventually migrated to civilian aviation through regulatory mandate and industry acceptance. The fuel tank secret, once a tactical advantage for German bombers, became a permanent feature of aviation safety worldwide. The chemistry of rubber swelling and fuel contact, the mechanics of leather containment layers, the physics of vapor space inerting, these technical details, worked out under wartime urgency by engineers who never expected their work would influence civilian airliners or modern stealth fighters, continue saving lives 8 decades later. That may be the deepest legacy. Not that one side gained temporary advantage, but that knowledge, once discovered, spreads and persists and eventually serves purposes far beyond its origin. November 1942. The desert wind has died down, leaving the air still and cold under the North African stars. Captain Richard Caldwell returns to the recovery site one last time before the Ju-88 wreckage is trucked away for shipment to technical intelligence depots. He carries a flashlight and a camera, intending to document final details that might be missed during transport. The bomber rests exactly as it did that first afternoon, but Caldwell sees it differently now. The bullet holes in the wing aren't simply damage, they're data points in a story about material science meeting violence. Each puncture represents a moment where chemistry made a decision: seal or leak, contain or fail, preserve or destroy. The decisions were made by molecules of rubber swelling in gasoline, by leather fibers distributing tensile loads, by the careful layering of dissimilar materials into a system greater than its parts. He thinks about the German engineers who designed this system, working in offices in Dessau or testing ranges at Rechlin. They would have known, even as they specified rubber thickness and leather grades, that their work would eventually be captured and analyzed. Secrecy in wartime is always temporary, but they built it anyway, built it well enough that Allied crews would die before the secret was fully unlocked. That calculation, weighing knowledge against time, security against capability, defined technical competition in warfare. The fuel tank sample he had cut weeks earlier had traveled through laboratories at Wright Field and MIT, been sliced into microscope sections, had its chemistry analyzed by spectroscopy and its mechanics characterized by tensile testing. The reports filled manila folders with graphs and tables and technical terminology. But the essence remained simple. When you make a hole in this material, the material tries to fix itself. Not perfectly, not instantly, but well enough to change outcomes in that narrow window between being hit and catching fire. Caldwell runs his fingers along the wing's leading edge, feeling the rivets and seams that hold the structure together. Modern aircraft are assemblies of compromises: weight versus strength, performance versus range, capability versus cost. The self-sealing tanks added one more compromise to the equation: accept weight penalty and reduce capacity in exchange for survival probability. The Germans had made that trade early, while Allied air forces had hesitated, optimized other parameters first, paid for the delay and losses. The question that had driven the initial investigation, why didn't this bomber burn, now had answers technical and complete. But the deeper question, the one that would shape aviation for decades to come, was only beginning to be asked: how much protection is enough? Every layer of rubber added weight, every safety feature consumed resources. At some point, the protection became so comprehensive that the aircraft couldn't fulfill its mission. Finding the balance required understanding not just engineering, but economics, tactics, and the mathematics of attrition. "Germans got it right first," Sergeant Kowalski observes, appearing from the darkness. "We'll catch up eventually, but they got there first." "They had more motivation," Caldwell replies. "Battle of Britain taught them the cost of burning bombers. We learned different lessons in different theaters. Now we're learning theirs." The flashlight beam plays across the damaged wing, illuminating the complex topology of impact craters and rivet patterns. Somewhere in American factories, engineers are already incorporating these lessons into next-generation fuel tanks. The production lines will change, the specifications will evolve, and eventually Allied bombers will fly with protection matching or exceeding what the Germans achieved. The technical gap will close, as technical gaps always close, when enough resources and attention converge on problems. But the knowledge that the gap existed, that Allied crews flew missions for months or years with inferior protection, while the solution already existed on enemy aircraft, that burden would remain. It would shape post-war design philosophy, inform procurement decisions, and stand as a reminder that in technical competitions between nations, second place is measured in casualties. Caldwell takes a final photograph, the flash briefly illuminating the wreckage in harsh white light. Then darkness returns, and the bomber becomes a shadow again, indistinguishable from the desert around it. In the morning, the recovery crew will arrive, will cut apart the wings and fuselage, will load the pieces onto trucks for the long journey to laboratories where other engineers will continue the dissection. The aircraft will be reduced to samples and measurements, its secrets extracted and cataloged and eventually applied. But tonight, for these few hours, it remains complete. A Junkers Ju 88A4, serial number scratched into aluminum skin, testament to engineering decisions made in Germany years earlier. Decisions about rubber and leather, about weight and protection, about the fundamental question of how to keep crews alive and machines designed to go where death waited. The answers lie in the layers, in the chemistry, in the patient work of materials that seal their own wounds. The secret, such as it was always hiding in plain sight, visible to anyone who looked carefully enough. The trick was knowing to look,